Hey guys, so I'm your ad hoc entertainment while the MPs come up. So I'm going to pull this out of the back of my pants and see how I do. So we got something called a new Veterans Charter, okay? I think before we start talking about the new Veterans Charter, it's really important that we understand the concept of a Veterans Charter. So let's go back to World War II. December 1939, Prime Minister's Chief of Staff writes, look, we've just been at war, but we're going to have a lot of men and women coming home, and they're going to need help rehabilitating back to civilian life. It won't be an easy transition. Let's start those programs now. So by 1942, they had set up 11 parliamentary committees. These consisted of everyone from MPs across almost every federal department. It consisted of representatives from universities, from corporations, from hospitals, experts in the military, and of course it included veterans on these committees. And these committees came up with, probably we're talking now somewhere around the terms of 30 different pieces of legislation and regulations to help these guys come home, and women of course. Now the success of the original Veterans Charter cannot be understated. What we had is we had people coming home, and whether they were injured or not, they recognized that if a veteran had to be indoctrinated and trained to get into the military, they needed training and boot camp to get back out into the civilian force. Because it's not an easy transition to get into the military, and therefore it's not going to be an easy transition to get back into the civilian workforce. How did they do that? Everyone, whether disabled or not, was entitled to a whole host of benefits. And those benefits included, for instance, returning lump sums depending on how long they served. They were given a choice of either university or housing mortgages or startup loans or trade schools. They were given assistance with either starting farming or fishing. And if they were disabled, they were provided with a lifelong disability payments for themselves and of course for their spouses and any children that they may have, as well as orphans. Now this was the original charter. Now it's not just that it was good for the veterans. This was an investment in all of Canada that historians and economists have largely accepted, that the success, and Canada was one of the powerhouses of the world economy in the 50s and 60s, that success was in principle, in large part due to the investment that we made in those veterans coming back. That the growth of economy skyrocketed, that the well-being that we all enjoy today, the foundation was in investing in veterans coming back. We graduated, for instance, somewhere around 8,000 engineers, 55,000 veterans went to university, 3,000 doctors, 5,000 teachers. Now, let's go back, or let's go ahead. After 1953, the veterans returning from Korea, Canadian Forces personnel were not given any of these benefits. There's no reason why they shouldn't have been. The casualty rate in terms of injuries has been almost as high in peacetime as it has been for those soldiers that served in World War II. And in fact, why should someone who served perhaps in Afghanistan or in Bosnia or in the Gulf War, why should they not have enjoyed the benefits when someone who never actually deployed during World War II was provided with all of those benefits? Mortgage, with assistance for starting up businesses, with those lump sums to just get their leg up, with health care and extra health care on top of that. So the question being is, why were those benefits denied to the Canadian Forces veterans? They weren't. There's no reason, sorry, that they should have been denied. So then what happened is we had a situation where in the 1990s, the cliche decade of darkness, and Michel Drapeau was well familiar with that because most of us were serving that time. And we had a situation where the forces were the first ones to bring attention to the quality of life issues in the military. And we have a good member in our audience, Joe Sharp, who headed up one of those important inquiries that resulted from the public scandals in the way that our forces personnel and their families were treated. So in 1997, they set up the Standing Committee on National Defense and Veterans Affairs. And they went, and they didn't sit on Parliament Hill. They went around to all the bases, and they heard from privates, and they heard from corporals, and they heard from their wives, and they heard from their children. And these things were made public, and news stories broke about privates holding down 2 and 3 extra jobs just to make ends meet, that living in PMQs that were being condemned, that families that were falling apart because there was no help for them. And so what immediately happened, before those committee hearings even ended, and before two other hearings, the McClellan and the Stowe inquiries that were also started for serving members, is that they immediately implemented change. They started changing the way that the forces personnel were treated. Now there was some mention of veterans, for instance, in the Croatia BOI. Although the mandate did not extend to veterans, it was natural that we looked at a continuum, that the way that we served and the way that we get out of the forces has to be met with some sort of cohesiveness so that we don't lose the potential of who the forces personnel are, what they can contribute to society, and make sure that they don't fall deeper into despair. So while National Defense is doing all of this, and that we saw pay raises increase in 1997 so that you had, for instance, inflation only increasing somewhere around 30% since 1997, but the military pay has increased somewhere around 80%. Now let's look at what Veterans Affairs did. Nothing. 1999, they implemented a helpline. In 2000, that they announced that we're going to change the definition of veterans to include all those that successfully completed their MOC training. That it wasn't until 2002, I believe, or 2003, that they initiated a task force to start up the design of what they called the new Veterans Charter. Now remember, the original Veterans Charter was 11 parliamentary committees. We had people from all across Canadian society and the veterans and experts contributing to designing a Veterans Charter that would be comprehensive in helping veterans reintegrate in society. What did they do at Veterans Affairs? They gave it to a director. All the members of the staff were below the rank of a director inside the public service. There wasn't a single veteran on there. There wasn't a single medical personnel. There wasn't a single person from another department. It was all an internal group that came up with, they designed the new Veterans Charter. Grand in title, not grand in contribution to the veterans. So they came up, of course, and they said we need to help rehabilitate these soldiers. And by the way, we're going to take away that lifelong pension for disability and replace it with a one-time lump sum. Now, they said you can't look at the lump sum. Remember, we can't look at that in isolation because there's all these other programs that we've contributed now to veterans. But what they didn't tell the public is that although Veterans Affairs didn't provide an earnings loss benefit before, there was CISIP long-term disability that provided the same amount, and the earnings loss benefit mirrored exactly that. That they said, well, we now have this permanent impairment allowance. But of course, before that, they didn't tell that Veterans Affairs had an exceptional incapacity allowance. And so every program, almost to the T, that was in the new Veterans Charter existed before. It was merely rebanded and repackaged and called the new Veterans Charter. And it was supposed to be the be-all and end-all. So there's two posters up on the side, and maybe sometime during the night you'll be able to look at this as some of the facts and figures about how successful has the Charter been. Well, it wasn't until 2009, 3 years after the new Veterans Charter came into force, that they actually had any education benefits as part of this rehabilitation plan. It wasn't until 2011, 5 years afterwards, that they even sponsored a single veteran to go to university. So at right now count, we're talking about, so far the new Veterans Charter has put somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30 individuals through university, right? How many medical releases have we had? And by the way, the new Veterans Charter is only for those that are disabled. This isn't for all the forces members. They do have a program that's universal. It's job training, career training, transition assistance, which was originally in the new Veterans Charter. Quietly and without any applause, is that D&D took that back. So now the new Veterans Charter consists of just programs for the disabled. So we do have no general programs for the rest of the military transitioning. People say, well, why do they need help? Well, are we so much smarter today that our soldiers don't need help transitioning even if they're not disabled, but they needed transitioning help after World War II? I don't think so. I don't think we're any smarter today. And in fact, Veterans Affairs, in its wisdom, refuses to track the needs of 89% of our veterans. Only 11% of Canada's 700,000 Canadian Forces veterans are clients of Veterans Affairs. Now let's put that in perspective. You say, well, you have to be disabled to be a client of Veterans Affairs. No, you can also need some economic foot up. Maybe, to what degree do we know those 89% remaining military, they're getting out, they may not have a disability, or maybe they got rejected for the disability. And to what degree are they saying, you know what, I don't want to be a burden on Canada. I don't want to be a whiner. I'm a hero, remember? So I'm not going to complain if I'm suffering something. So what do? They go take a nighttime job, you know, when they were highly skilled in some adept weapon system that required great training, and all of a sudden they're doing a nighttime security job, part-time, you know, to supplement that small pension that they have. How many veterans are getting into the forces and selling themselves out cheap? We don't know, because Veterans Affairs refuses to track what happens with 89% of the veterans. Now let's contrast that with Australia. Australia, just in compensation and income programs alone for its veterans, provides support to over 50% of its veterans that transition out of the military. 11% Canada, 50% for Australia. I don't think the military experiences are too different. Why does Australia do that? Well, they say that right in their annual reports. It's widely accepted that there's a different culture about the military that is not always compatible with the civilian culture. That we can't take all those military values and necessarily throw them into a civilian workplace. So we need some help. We need a leg up to get in there. But not just for the disabled, we need help for everyone. But Veterans Affairs, of course, has kind of lost attention to the fact that there's a unique culture in the military. Why? Because only 97% of the employees at Veterans Affairs have never served in the military. Somewhere around 3% apparently have worn a uniform. And in fact, other than the seconded General Seminole that's over at Veterans Affairs, not a single senior bureaucrat, director level and above in Veterans Affairs, has ever worn a uniform. And those are the ones that design the programs such as the new Veterans Charter. So that's why we're in the mess we are today. And is the new Veterans Charter being successful? Well, we've seen an unprecedented call for help from veterans in the media, from organizations. In fact, only 2 weeks ago, that a unanimous meeting of veterans organizations coordinated by the Legion, something we haven't seen in Canada, probably if ever, because I don't think veterans organizations have ever been able to be unanimous on anything. Okay? They came together and they've signed and they said, we want you to implement all the recommendations that have been outstanding from all our committee reports. Now that first letter that was signed about 3 years ago by those the unanimous opinion of these organizations, the department said, we can't implement all those, so give us 3. So we kept insisting. So finally we said, we're going to call your bluff, here's 3. So what did Minister Fantino do last week? He says, give us 1. Pick 1 out of those 3 and we'll do it. So, you know, veterans are slowly being whittled down, demoralized, humiliated, and we wonder why they run to the streets, run to the media. Why? Because they're not getting the help and support that they need. Because there's no accurate tools out there to assess whether we are getting the help. Now, there is some hope on the horizon. The Military and Veterans Health Review Forum, okay, and the Institute, has coordinated 29 universities to start doing some of this research. But research takes a long time, especially longitudinal research. There's help that we need now, and there's some recommendations on the table, such as, let's increase that earnings loss benefit, not from 75%, but to 100%. Heck, workers' comp, okay, in a longitudinal study has shown that when you compare workers injured in the civilian workplace in BC and Ontario, that the average for the most disabled, now the most unlikely able to find any part-time work, that under the disability programs of workers' comp in those 2 provinces, that they have averaged anywhere from 102% of their working members to 120% of the salaries of the working members. Canada's military, for some reason, has pegged us at 75%, or not military, sorry, the bureaucracy's pegged us at 75%. We had a case today, for instance, where a young corporal was just